In this video, we are going to discuss different types of outliers, in particular, ones that are important and influential, high leverage outliers. This is the one slide in our entire video, so we're going to dispense with the overview and the summary, and we're just going to get right into the main portion of our video. The first idea we want to talk about is that some outliers are important and influential. We call them high leverage points. These are points that fall horizontally away from the center of the cloud and tend to pull harder on the line. So here is a point that potentially could be high leverage, but I'm pointing to it because it falls horizontally, right, in the Y direction, away from the main part of the line. We call them points with high leverage. We say a point is influential if, had we fitted the line without it, the influential point would have been unusually far from the least squares line. In other words, the line would be different without these high leverage points or these influential points. So these are our 6 examples we'll look through. Over here in our first example, there's one outlier, this outlier here, quite far from the other points, though it only appears to slightly influence the line. Let's take a little bit closer look. So this one point here, without it, when I would try to fit these lines here, I would think that the line would go more through the center of these points and then kind of start coming down to accommodate these points until finally it fit these points here. So as you can see, if I were just visually to try to fit a line, it probably would have been a little bit higher up at the beginning. So in this way, this point does influence my regression line, and it is an outlier that's influencing my regression line. So I don't know if I would call it high leverage because, the line was still pretty close, but it does appear to slightly influence the line. So that's kind of the take on here, a slight influence. This next graph over here, well, there's this one outlier over here, but really, when I draw my line through these points, it comes over here. This point, it's pretty close to the least squares line, right? It's no further than any of these other points. So this outlier, it seems okay. It is not very influential. Let's look at this third line. Now we have this point way over here. And this one is one that I would suspect of being high leverage because it's far away horizontally from the least squared line. So let's take another look at this. It really is over here as we get closer to this point that the least squared line sort of gets pulled upwards, right? Because I feel like the center of these points is more over here. I would draw something more like this yellow line. Over here at the beginning, this seems to be pretty good. Everything's kind of clustering around. But by the time we get here, we want something more towards the middle of these two, right? This line that is drawn in black seems to favor these points that are higher up. And that's because this point over here is pulling everything up. So this might be one of those high leverage points. Let's look at graph number 4. So there's this primary cloud here, and then there's this secondary cloud. And this cloud, again, does seem to be pulling the line a little bit further up, right? Because here, the least squared line isn't fitting this cluster so much, right? You would want it to kind of go through the middle, but this cluster pulls it up away. But, the thing about this is it's a cluster. It's not a single outlier. So you might want to take a closer look at what this cluster is about. So the secondary cloud, this cluster here, appears to be influencing the line fairly strongly. Again, otherwise it would be going further down through the middle of this little set of points. So making the least square line fit poorly actually almost everywhere. That is true. Actually, the line is also kind of funky over here because it really should go through these points. And again, there might be an interesting explanation for the dual clouds, which is something that could be investigated. This one's interesting because without this point, we just have this cluster, which really doesn't look like a line. So it's almost like the line we drew took the center of this little mass of points and drew a line through the center up to this other point here. So without this outlier point, this would hardly be a line, right? It just looks like a blob. So there's no obvious trend in the main cloud of points, and the outlier to the right appears to largely control the slope of the least squares line. So this point I would consider high leverage and influential. This last example, here we have one outlier far from these other points, but you can see it's actually on the line. It doesn't have, like here, it doesn't have a huge distance, vertical distance from the line. So this one is not a high leverage point. It's not influential. There's one outlier, however, it falls quite close to the least squares line and does not appear to be very influential. And one last note. While it may be tempting to remove outliers, don't do this without a very good reason. Models that ignore exceptional cases often perform poorly. For instance, if a financial firm ignored the latest market swings, the outliers, they would go bankrupt and be making poorly thought out investments.